Hello and welcome to Vendor Trash. Is the title a reference to my opinions, my drawing skills, or both? That's for you to decide. If you've been watching Vendor Trash videos for any length of time, you know the expansion that I throw the most shade at, particularly for its writing, is Battle for Azeroth. Though I enjoy the expansion as a whole, as I always do, I did not enjoy its overarching story. Moreover, it is the expansion whose story I feel was not only lackluster, but actually detrimental to WoW as a whole. And you know, for the most part, I'd be content to simply point out its flaws and leave it at that. I'm just one person, and I'm not the one getting paid to write the story. As I've said a few times, I try not to assume that I could do better, especially given the constraints of game development that often go unseen by the public. And it's always worth bearing in mind that it's often easier to refine an existing story than to craft one from scratch. But you know what? I do like to consider myself a writer, and BFA has eaten away at my thoughts more than enough, so yeah, it's time to put up or shut up. After much contemplation, I present to you Battle for Azeroth as I believe it should have unfolded. Now, as a general rule, I don't want to cheat the assignment. There's plenty of things from beforehand that I'd like to change, such as the death of Cairn, but I have to draw the line somewhere. That's why the only pre-BFA alterations I'm going to make are the deaths of Varian and Vol'jin at the start of Legion. For starters, this does nothing to really change the events of that expansion, as the factions really took a back seat outside of the Stormheim storyline. Moreover, I feel that these two leaders would make for a far more compelling faction war than Anduin and Sylvanas. Although some players weren't a fan of how Varian seemed to be too amazing and dominated the Alliance leadership, I really didn't mind him, at least as a Horde player. He seemed to strike a good balance of aggression and sensibility. While his death was epic and all, I don't think it was worth losing him from the story, and he certainly lends himself to a morally gray narrative better than his son ever could. On the Horde side, pretty much nobody was happy to see Vol'jin die after becoming War Chief and doing nothing of note for one expansion. It made his character feel almost pointless. And again, though his funeral scene was a very moving cinematic, it was not worth the cost. And likewise, though I do think Sylvanas is a morally gray character, she works best when not in the spotlight, and Vol'jin can likewise lend himself to the desired narrative better. I'm going to utilize the same starting point that BFA had, which was the Before the Storm novel. By and large, I would keep the events of the novel the same, modified only to account for Varian and Vol'jin still being around, and cutting out most of the totalitarian undertones from Sylvanas. Anduin still gets it in his head to reunite the human survivors of Lordaeron with their forsaken relatives, but this time needs to talk his father into allowing it to happen. Sylvanas agrees with similar stipulations to what happened originally. It's a trial thing, everyone goes home afterward, and there be no funny business. Anduin still gets introduced to Kalia Menethil, who wants to help with the whole event. And, just like in the original, Kalia breaks the established protocol and makes her way into the gathering. Sylvanas notices her presence and shoots her down, though in this version, Sylvanas does not kill her own civilians, or at least none of those who started heading back after the signal. If you want her to kill the ones that ignored the order, then that's okay, I suppose. Sylvanas' actions here are more justified as she isn't killing any of her loyal citizens, and Kalia was a clear breach of the meeting's parameters. Nevertheless, Anduin is devastated by her death. Genn is infuriated at the death of Taranis' daughter. Already hateful of Sylvanas due to the events of Cataclysm, he uses Kalia's death to push Varian into devoting manpower into finally retaking Gilneas. Varian agrees, as he does view it as their territory by right, and at this point, he doesn't trust the Horde to return it through peaceful negotiations. Funnily enough, Vol'jin would have been willing to agree to a territory trade, but he cannot tolerate the forceful takeover of what is currently Horde territory, and so he agrees to devote resources to defending their claim. Thus would begin the pre-patch event, the Reclamation of Gilneas. This would take place over several weeks and involve the Alliance and Horde doing dailies and other activities to facilitate the war effort. At the end of the event, the Alliance would ultimately prove successful and return Gilneas to their control. I feel like this would be a far more realistic and satisfying process of taking the city than the 12-minute quest chain we got in Dragonflight that felt like an absolute joke. I would also reward the Alliance by making Gilneas City an actual, functional capital city. Yes, it would cause an imbalance between the factions, but I think this is okay, at least temporarily. As an aside, Anduin still goes about bringing Kalia back to the Netherlight Temple, and alongside Alonsis Fowl and Sahara, raises her back as a light-bound undead. Although Gilneas is retaken, neither faction is exactly ready to stand down. Sensing that this campaign is likely to escalate into all-out war, Jaina approaches Varian and offers to act as an emissary to bring Kultiris back into the Alliance properly. He agrees, as the Kultiran Navy would be an invaluable resource whether things escalate or not. Vol'jin shadow hunters manage to catch sight of Jaina setting sail for Kultiris. He finds this very suspicious, as if she was only going there for personal reasons, she would have teleported. This is a diplomatic mission. Knowing the Horde would be seriously disadvantaged if this comes to pass, he takes it upon himself to recruit his own allies, the Zandalari, and sets sail for Zandalar. And so we enter patch 8.0. Now, this next bit is entirely unnecessary for my rewrite to work, but just the result of a personal preference. I was never a fan of BFA zones being split onto two separate continents. It made the open world experience feel a bit disjointed, as you would essentially teleport to the 3 zones on the enemy island. But it had been established that Zandalar was sinking after the Cataclysm. That was later retconned away, but I think we can use it. In the process of Zandalar sinking, have it collide with Kultiris and have that collision save the island. I know that canonically the islands are nowhere near close enough for that to actually work, but that also feels like the tiniest retcon in the world to make for a much better experience. The easiest arrangement in my mind is to have Northeast Nazmir crash into Southwest Strustvar, and you could have the new conglomeration be referred to as Zultiris. On the Alliance side, things would mostly unfold the same way. Jaina is treated as a pariah at first, but by the end of the campaign manages to become accepted once again, and with Ashvane being ousted. On the Horde side, Vol'jin would personally speak with King Rastakhan. I think the two would get along well. Though prideful, Rastakhan is aware of the state that his empire is in, and if we go with the Zultiris idea, we can give him even more incentive to team up with the Horde. It stands to reason that Kultirans would not take kindly to the sudden Zandalari presence right on their doorstep, and the 2 islands would probably already have a hostile relationship. Rastakhan will also hold a degree of respect for Vol'jin for having ascended to being the first non-orc war chief of the Horde. With all that in mind, he agrees to join the Horde if they're able to help them with all of their local problems first. Again, the leveling experience is treated mostly the same, perhaps a few more skirmishes between the factions, and with oddities like Brenadam either reworked or removed. I'm sure some of the war campaign would change by simple merit of the original one having a lot of random, almost nonsensical elements to it. Stuff like the Horde working with the Sanlayan, but that only being revealed to Alliance players. Things like that. All of the dungeons are the same, with a slight tweak to Waycrest Manor that I'll touch on later, though I think I'd have removed the Motherlode. Not that I have anything against the dungeon, but it feels weird the way it was implemented. I would have saved it until we got a proper Kazan patch down the line. In its stead, I would have added Gorabal. The whole Azerite subplot isn't really necessary in my version, but given we're fresh off of Legion, we should have had at least a few quests relating to the giant sword impaling the planet. The giant red eye on the guard always struck me as being similar to an instance portal. Basically, I think it'd be cool if the interior of Gorabal was filled with demons who, whether by Sargeras' command or their own directive, want to corrupt Azeroth. You would descend through the sword and eliminate the demons, removing it as a threat. At least for the time being. Though, as I've said before, I would have had it strike the ocean instead of Silithus proper. On the raid front, Uldir still happens and canonically is cleared out by Talanji and the Horde. On the Alliance side of things, Kalia is finding her new existence extremely difficult. Although she has been spared most of the physical anguishes of how one is normally raised into undeath, she has not been spared all of the emotional ones. Despite Anduin and a few others accepting her, she quickly discovers that the undead will never truly be welcome in the Alliance. Even the Death Knights stick to themselves, though she doesn't exactly feel at home amidst them either. Eventually, she decides to set out on her own. As far as allied races go, we aren't doing them. There can still be unlock quests for Dark Iron Dwarves, Lightforged Draenei, Meghar Orcs, High Mountain Tauren, and eventually Mechagnomes as customization options. Nightborn continue to favor the Horde, though don't join, at least as a playable race. And again, I say that as someone who mains a Nightborn. Volpera in the same boat. Void Elves just aren't a thing. I want to try to preserve the prestige of being a playable race, so the only ones we're getting in BFA will be coherents and Zandalari. If you've been paying attention, I've done absolutely nothing in regards to Teldrassil or Darkshore. It's not so much that I care about protecting Night Elves, I just think that it's unnecessary to the plot, especially with us expanding on the Lordaeron stuff a bit. We don't need the burning of Teldrassil to serve as some shock value moment to mark Sylvanas' descent into pure evil. And frankly, I don't like destroying zones. As such, the Darkshore Warfront does not happen. I guess the Arathi Warfront can happen, if we're still doing Warfronts at all. Importantly, none of the Sylvanas vs Sourfang stuff would be present for obvious reasons. In fact, the two are collaborating quite closely in holding the Lordaeron front against the Gilneans, along with Nathanos. To everyone's surprise, a familiar figure has made her way behind their front lines and wishes to speak with the Banshee Queen. Sylvanas agrees to the meeting and has a conversation with Kalia Menethil, and muses to the former princess that just as her brother kicked off the Third War, she was the spark of the Fourth. Although I guess for whatever reason Varian and Garrosh's war never got properly numbered. Kalia explains that there is no place for her or other undead among the living anymore, and apologizes for the stunt she pulled back in Arathi. She just wants to be with her people, the Lordaeronians. Sylvanas acknowledges her apology, stating that many of them had delusions about how they'd be treated before they came to truly understanding the nature of undeath. She also states that there is a place among the Forsaken for her, if she's willing to leave certain things behind. And there is a place for her among the living, specifically among the Horde, which has come to accept the undead for who they are. They are not like the Judgmental Alliance. They are not monsters, but they are a home for the monstrous. It's where they can truly belong. Kalia accepts the offer. As we enter patch 8.1, the main focus remains the same, the Battle of Dazar'alor raid. Though I do have a few changes I'd like to make. For personal preference, I'd have the entire raid take place within the pyramid, and rename it to something like Dazari Catacombs. I just prefer when my raids are new areas. But as for actually important changes, I would change up some of the bosses and boss order. Maybe have a Loa presence and be killed in the siege. Importantly, Gelbin must remain a boss fight and have his escape pod moment. Jaina can remain a boss, though it isn't necessary. A pivotal change is that during one of the fights, in which Talanji is fighting the Alliance either as an NPC or as a boss herself, she winds up critically injured. Upon discovering what the Alliance has done to his daughter, Rastakhan enters a rage and serves as the final boss of the raid. The Alliance must stand against him, but ultimately he survives the fight and they are forced to flee. As I've stated before, Rastakhan was way too interesting of a character to kill off so quickly, and while I could have simply swapped him and his daughter around, killing Talanji off here would have both felt like possibly fridging her, and also render the plot point of his deal with Wan Samdi irrelevant. So, to keep that thread going, I instead will leave her to recover, though at a cost. Perhaps she loses her eyesight or something. Now I'm going to be forthcoming here and admit that I do not have a resolution to this plot line in my rewrite. That's not to say that I intend for it to be a dropped plot thread, but I feel like it's something that can be saved for another day and another expansion, just so long as it is eventually addressed. Maybe something in Midnight, since that's another expansion that's going to give trolls a little bit of focus. At any rate, in the aftermath of the raid, Kul Tiras is in a pretty good spot. Their fleet is largely intact, while the Golden Fleet of the Zandalari has been decimated. They will rebuild, of course, as it's integral to their culture, but it will take time, and although the attack on Dazar'alor had to be abandoned, the Alliance is in a ripe position to clean up in patch 8.1.5. This patch will remain mostly the same, with us still unwittingly setting Xal'atath free to set her up for future events, and us still raiding the Crucible of Storms to slay Unat, and having a slight interaction with N'Zoth. And that's where I'm going to cut things off for this week, as it basically divides the BFA expansion in half. That, and if I left it as one video, it'd be over a half hour, which I don't like to do particularly often. Although I did make other changes, I feel the most important ones were just avoiding the whole Teldrassil debacle, and trying to set it up where both factions can feel that they are justified in their actions, instead of the Horde appearing as evil and the Alliance as lawful stupid. Basically, I want the faction war expansion to actually invoke faction pride in all players. Anyway, we'll continue it next week, where the changes start to become even greater. For this week's drawing, I decided to go with Kalia Menethil, because as I had Sylvanas state earlier, she basically is the catalyst for the Fourth War in my version. And there is a lot to say about Kalia. For starters, she feels like a major miscalculation by the lore team. She was very clearly being set up as a replacement for Sylvanas, but the way that Horde players and Forsaken players in particular reacted to her was so hostile that they basically had to change their minds on it. Though that still didn't stop them from shoving Kalia onto the new Desolate Council, and having a quest chain towards the end of Shadowlands that felt like it was trying to convince us that Kalia is actually awesome. Seriously, one of Forsaken players' main complaints against her is that the way she was raised into undeath spares her a lot of the physical pain that normal Forsaken experience. So they have Kalia bring this up herself to Margrave Sindane. And Sindane basically says, necromancy is necromancy no matter how you do it. Stop being so mean to Kalia, you stupid players. Don't you see how awesome she is? Obviously, I'm paraphrasing more than a little bit here, but that is the general sentiment that I and many other players felt. And heck, during the anniversary event, Voss even describes Kalia as being popular with the Alliance. And you know, unless we have some super secret scheme to use this to destroy the Alliance or something, I don't want to hear that. Now, my personal feelings towards Kalia are probably a bit different than most Horde players, and I attribute that entirely to my completely inaccurate headcanon of what the character could be if she felt like less of an overt usurper to Sylvanas, and instead became one of her most useful and loyal subordinates. I think there's a lot we can work with there. Yes, she is the sister of the man who slew and raised Sylvanas, but I think Sylvanas would be willing to move past that once they were actually interacting. And I like the very comedic interpretation of Kalia being this very bubbly and saccharine Forsaken character that basically stands in direct juxtaposition to everyone else around her. Make her the kind of person to stick a band-aid on the local abomination that she befriended, without really making the connection that he's about to head off and rip a human soldier in half. There's a ton of comedy gold potential there, but even if you don't really lean into that, I do think there are some interesting plot threads that you could examine over the years. And frankly, I don't think it's a bad idea to flesh out the Forsaken's roster of characters a little bit more than it was. So ultimately, I both hate and love Kalia as a character. I hate her for how she's actually used, and I love her for how I like to imagine she could have been used. I also really like her design, and no, I'm not referring to the fact that they gave her massive mammaries, but rather the contrast of her being undead, but having a very priestly, holy appearance, which means that she's simultaneously pretty and incredibly terrifying to wrap your head around. There's something very scary about the idea of a holy lady of undeath. Anyway, I plopped her into Hillsbrad Foothills as it was stated that South Shore is basically where she ran off to and started her family. I could have actually drawn her in South Shore, but seeing as that town is blighted to heck and back, it seemed almost a little too cruel to do that. So instead, I stuck her by the sludge fields. You know, where the human plants are. Hey now, those were never officially sanctioned. That doesn't mean they were a bad idea, but you cannot blame them on the Forsaken as a faction. So yeah, just let her have her own little house there, I guess. I think that's everything. Thank you for watching, and I will catch you next week. Bye-bye.